So welcome, as I've already said, but I'll repeat myself. I'm Amanda Abraham. I'm the Director of Development at the Land Trust. So any fundraising asks that you get for the pond or otherwise come from me and my colleagues. I've been with the trust for 6 years and I love working on this project. I think it's a really important one and it will inform other remediation efforts at other coastal ponds.
I don't care.
So, yeah, thank
Any
you for joining
pepper
us.
there, Pippi.
Oh, I'm sorry. Whoever's talking, could you mute yourself? Thank you. And thank you so much too for the many people. I'm going to wait for that person to mute themselves. Or Liv, if you could figure out who it is, just
It's Jerry Brown. His
Hi,
name
Jerry.
comes up.
So we are fundraising for this project. We've been doing that since I think it was help me Matt, but I think it was, or Josh, 2017 or 18 when we first got involved in this.
How long ago?
It was either, I believe it was actually 2017, or it might have been the beginning of 18. We started working with Chris Gobler at Stony Brook University, who will be one of our presenters tonight.
Wonderful.
And this year alone, we're hoping to raise $95,000. I apologize. We could have covered that right now. So far, we've raised $209,000 of that $495,000. And that's part of why you're here to listen to this presentation to understand where those funds would go for this year to support the work at the pond. Before I turn this over to our Vice President, Matt Swain, I have a couple of housekeeping items. So first, Matt will give a short overview of the history of the project and then introduce our two different groups of presenters. And then after their presentations, that's when we'll address any questions that you might have. So please mute yourself during the presentation, and any questions that pop into your head, just put them into the group chat. My colleague, Olivia Waterhouse, who's the Trust Donor Relations Coordinator, will be collating all of those questions, and then we'll be able to ask them at the end to the presenters, and you'll probably be able to chime in a little bit at that point. And if there are questions you just want to send to me or another staff person privately, please do that as well. So if there are no questions right now, I'm going to kick it over to Matt to make the introductions.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Matt. Thanks for coming tonight. I'm very excited for this presentation. Amanda said, you know, about 5 years, we started a lot of work there with Dr. Gobler's lab, where he did installation of monitoring buoys, did a lot of modeling and research on pollution in their sources. And over time, we were able to, you know, take private dollars raised from the community, all of you, and leverage it for public dollars like the CPF fund. We've done a lot of pond-wide studies with Cornell Cooperative Extension. We're now moving into Poxabog Pond and doing some work. But it's been a really good partnership. Peconic Land Trust, the town of Southampton has been very supportive. Stony Brook University, now we're working with the Center for Clean Water Technology, and of course, Cornell Cooperative Extension. This project is particularly exciting to me because it's like a model project. You know, we can use what we find out here at Sagg Pond and kind of use that to work for management plans and other things in other coastal ponds across the island. Unfortunately, Sagg Pond's not the only pond that needs help. We're even currently working in parallel right now in a lot of things we're doing at Sagg Pond for Georgica Pond. But, you know, we're going to get into that a little bit, but we have some really good presenters tonight. The first is Dr. Chris Gobler, Director of the Center for Clean Water Technology at Stony Brook University. And then Tom Varley, who Peconic Land Trust has used funds raised through the community to fund his position as a watershed manager with the overall goal of really upgrading septic systems throughout the watershed. So we're excited to have Tom on board. And then once they give their presentation, we'll have Dr. Molly Graffam and Ron Paulsen from Cornell Cooperative Marine Extension to talk to us a little bit about permeable reactive barriers and also groundwater nitrogen. So Dr. Gobler, if you want to jump on in.
Sure thing. Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for tuning in, and excited to see everybody and talk about this great partnership that my lab and the Center for Clean Water Technology has had with the Peconic Land Trust. Yeah, I think going back, I think at least 6 or 7 years. And so, you know, this effort has all been towards understanding what's happening in the pond, what are the stressors on the pond, what are the problems within the pond, and then figuring out solutions. Some of you, I think, have seen my presentations about the pond before, and so for the interest of time and not repeating, I have sort of a truncated presentation that I'm giving today. And I'm just going to start out with what we've been doing in general over the years. And so this has been getting sort of as much information as we can about the pond so we can figure out how best to manage the pond. So the things we've been doing is over time, over the years, looking at the spatial and temporal dynamics of water quality. And that includes things like bacteria in the pond, algae in the pond, and oxygen levels. And then from the get-go, we understood that the algae levels have been fairly high. And sometimes the type we don't want. I'll talk more about that. So we've been trying to understand what promotes the overgrowth of the algae in the pond. And then we've been looking at the sources of nitrogen and phosphorus to the pond. And we've even done work on bivalves and oysters, although in the interest of time, I'm not going to have the ability to cover that this evening. But we can talk about that at another time. So every year for about the past 5 years, we've installed a water quality monitoring buoy within Sagg Pond. This has really been invaluable because it makes measurements not just when we're at the pond, but actually makes measurements 24/7. And the data is then telemetered to the web where we can monitor it. So on my lab's website, you can go there once we have the buoy installed, which we expect will happen later this month. And then of the different sites for monitoring, you can select for Sagg Pond and essentially pull down here under parameters exactly what you want to look at, the time period, and you'd get a plot like this. So I'm going to give a quick review now of that buoy data for 2022, just to give you a sense of what last year looked like. In some ways, it was very similar to prior years. In some ways, there were differences. So this is the level of salinity in the pond last year. And it actually gives you a super key insight, and that is Sagg Pond is one of 3 temporarily open estuaries within New York State. And so that is, as most of you know, the town of Southampton, specifically the trustees, manages the cut from Sagg Pond to the ocean and will open that cut several times per year. And I think I saw that we're joined on this Zoom by Ann Welker, one of the Southampton town trustees. So I'm sure she can talk about that later in the discussion point. But what you can see is the very strong effect that opening that cut has on the salinity. Ocean salinity in our coastal ocean is about 30 parts per thousand. And so what you can see is that prior to the opening, the pond wasn't quite fresh, which would be a salinity of 0, but it was quite low at 5. And you can see the very rapid response of the pond. You open up that cut, the ocean water starts flowing in. If you look at a little bit of the dynamics here, you can almost see a tidal exchange, so higher salinity at the high tide and then lower salinity at the lower tide. But then just within a week, and this often does happen in summer, that cut closes up on its own due to natural processes, tides, waves, etc. And then once it's closed, that salinity begins to sag down again. And the salinity is important because one of the types of algae we're most concerned with, blue-green algae or cyanobacteria, are actually most prominent when the salinity levels are low, and that's why opening the cut can be an important aspect. Another thing we measure within the pond are levels of dissolved oxygen. all life outside of bacteria needs dissolved oxygen to live. So that's a pretty important parameter to look at. And even most bacteria need oxygen. There's some that can get by without it. This data looks probably to you, as you look at it, may look a little messy, but it actually is perfectly natural the way it looks. These are actually what you're looking at here within this plot are literally thousands of data points. That's what you get out of the buoy. And it reflects the fact that in that data, we see the oxygen levels go up and down by day and night. So we get peaks during the day. We get low levels at night, particularly pre-dawn is the actual minimum. You see upon opening the cut that induces something we call stratification. The oxygen levels actually drop. But then once the cut is open, the levels are quite high. And once it closes, they get lower again. Now, I have in here what the DEC calls their chronic oxygen threshold of 4.8 milligrams per liter. And so what you can see is that in late summer, you see July going all the way into September, we are below that threshold. And so that's a sign that we've got to manage the levels of nutrients within the pond. I'll talk more about why that is going forward. So of all the things in the pond that we've been monitoring over the years, the one that I'm most concerned with and look at most carefully are cyanobacteria, also known as blue-green algae. I'm showing you some microscopic pictures of two of the types that we found in Sagg Pond. So microcystis is a colony-forming cyanobacteria. Anabaena is a chain-forming cyanobacteria. These are what are known as microalgae, so they're microscopic in the water, but they can discolor the water. And we worry about these cyanobacteria because they can make toxins, specifically toxins that can be poisonous to human. For example, microcystis makes microcystin. Anabaena makes anatoxin A. These are gastrointestinal and neurotoxins, respectively. And when these toxins were first discovered in the 20th century, they were called literally fast death factor for microcystin, and anatoxin A was deemed very fast death factor. So, and we worry about these because they do have roles in impairing human health. Now, thankfully, no one's drinking Sagg Pond as their drinking water source, but in places where they do, there's been associations between the consumption of such water and cancers, particularly gastrointestinal cancers. But there are pets on Georgica Pond, and the CDC has put out reports indicating that over the years, there's been hundreds of cases of dog poisonings associated with the consumption of water with cyanobacteria. And as some of you may know, just about a decade ago, a dog died on Georgica Pond, and upon autopsy, the New York State Department of Health declared the cause of death to be consumption of water contaminated with blue-green algae or cyanobacteria. And it's not just dogs that are at risk. Just as an additional point to make, a study that was published in a journal that I'm the editor of, Harmful Algae, just last year, solved a mystery that had been out there for science for a couple of years, and that in 2020, there was a die-off of hundreds of endangered elephants in the plains of Botswana in North Africa. And no one was really sure why. There were some hypotheses. Someone had put forth the idea that it could be blue-green algae blooms. And in fact, this study was able to confirm that. And you can see that these are ephemeral seasonal ponds that form in this country. And as they dry up and they have low levels of low volumes and high nutrients, they can form these blooms, and that can be lethal. So these are the upshot being, these are potent toxins, ones that we really want to make sure we have a handle on. So in 2020, we did see blue-green algae in the pond. When we monitored with the buoy, we saw that the levels drop when the cut was open and then increase thereafter. We also use New York State Department of Environmental Conservation certified methods for measuring blue-green algae. And in addition, we use New York State Department of Health Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program certified measurements of their toxins. So when using the DEC standard for measuring the blue-green algae, they have a particular standard they use for closures of 25 micrograms per liter. And what you can see is that we danced above and below that through the summer. The cut did again wash out the algae and lead to low levels, but they came back quite quickly. I have the genera of 2 different types of blue-green algae or cyanobacteria that we saw during these blooms. I'm going to give a summary of this later, but and then beyond just blue-green algae, the other thing is that the total levels of algae in Sagg Pond are very high as well. EPA would tell you that for a marine water body, we shouldn't have more than 20 micrograms per liter of chlorophyll A, and you can see we're well above that. And the reason that standard is there is because it leads to, above that, you've got poor water clarity, and that can also lead to the low levels of oxygen. But back on the blue-green algae front, just to summarize, over the years, so since I think over the last decade, I can say, we've seen 6 different genera or genus of blue-green algae, toxin cyanobacteria. We've measured the toxin microcystin at a concentration of up to 1.2 micrograms per liter. And for reference, the EPA drinking water standard is 0.3 micrograms per liter. But although, again, thankfully, no one's drinking the pond as their water. But regardless, we want to not have these events. Thankfully, this is not Sagg Pond, but just to give you a sense of what these blooms can look like, this is like Agawam in Southampton. We know these events can be promoted by nitrogen or phosphorus, and the approaches for managing these 2 nutrients are entirely different. We did nitrogen budgets and phosphorus budgets. I'm going to show you those momentarily. But if you wanted to control phosphorus, you'd be taking a totally different management tack than it would be for nitrogen. So we want to understand what's most important. To understand that and answer that question, we collect water and we conduct standard nutrient bioassay experiments where we're incubating water from Sagg Pond and then amending it with either nitrogen or phosphorus or both compounds. And when we've done that, we've gotten a very clear result. And so here's the results after incubating the water for, I think, about 48 hours. We see that nitrogen increases the concentrations of the blue-green algae. Phosphorus doesn't, but if you combine the 2 together, you get even more of an output than you do with just the nitrogen. But still, statistically, this would tell us that nitrogen is the prime factor driving these blue-green algae blooms. And so that being the case, we've done work to understand what are the different sources of nitrogen to the pond. And so specifically measuring things like fertilizer, atmospheric deposition, sediment fluxes, wastewater, and then also volumetric fluxes, birds, animals, etc. Part of doing this, as I mentioned, is to look at the sediment. So we've done comprehensive sediment studies, for example, to understand where muds are within the Sagg Pond and the depth of those muds. With that, we can measure the flux of nutrients out of the muds. We've also looked at the amount of organic matter in the muds, which again gives you a sense of the flux of nutrients out of the muds. And then we gathered groundwater data throughout the watershed to try to understand where are the nitrogen hotspots across Sagg Pond. This was done in conjunction with Suffolk County. So what you can see, this is the watershed of Sagg Pond. So these are all the areas that are contributing water into the pond. You'll note these 2 donut holes here. These donut holes really are what these represent are community supply wells for drinking water. So areas in this zone, the water is not going towards the pond, but it's actually being taken out of the watershed and used for drinking water. That's both here and here. But all this other water eventually is making its way to the pond. And what you can see are some areas that are quite high in nitrate and nitrogen, specifically northwest of the neck of the pond there. When we looked at all the different nitrogen sources, we got this very interesting mix of the importance of different nitrogen sources to the pond, with the upshot being that we have on-site septic systems and cesspools representing 1/4 of the total nitrogen, another 1/4 coming from agricultural fertilizer, but residential lawns also being important, and then some other places, for example, golf courses, the atmosphere, pets, and benthic fluxes also coming into play. So this is where the nitrogen is coming from. We work very closely with Suffolk County and specifically Department of Health Services in their 2020 sub-watersheds plan, they also looked at Sagg Pond. They also put together the watershed. You can see that here. And in doing that, they assessed, firstly, that Sagg Pond was what they called an ecological sensitivity rank of 1, making it the highest priority of any type of water body in all of Suffolk County for nitrogen mitigation. And specifically, if you look at this lower area here, they came up with a goal of reducing the nitrogen loads by 63%. And so just to come back here, if you want to reduce by 63%, you need to be addressing actually more than one source of nitrogen. But you want to start with the ones that are most important. So that's cesspools and septic tanks being at the top and fertilizers thereafter. And so as I wrap up, you're about to hear from my colleague, but I am the director of the New York State Center for Clean Water Technology, where we're harnessing science to engineer clean water for the protection of public health and the environment in New York and beyond. And so Tom's going to tell you all about septic systems. So maybe just some very quick overlap here, but I mean, the bottom line is these systems, anybody living in the watershed, unless they've upgraded their system, has either just simply a leaching pool or a septic tank attached to a leaching pool. And the fact of the matter is what these systems are designed to do is to spill their contents into groundwater. And then that groundwater, of course, then goes into the pond. That's the intended use. And we've already talked about wells. There's some public supply wells in there. So, you know, if you're not, what water doesn't get discharged into the pond is actually being extracted to drink. And Tom's going to tell you about a on-site septic system solution that we've developed at the center called the nitrogen removing biofilter. And so I won't go into the details. Tom will tell you all about this and how well it's done. And in breaking news, we just learned last week, or 2 weeks ago it is now, that we've had enough of these installed for a long enough time and achieved the right levels of nitrogen that they've been approved for use in Suffolk County. And we've got multiple people who can install them. And I'm sure Tom will tell you, but they are the best performing systems in Suffolk County. And they take out not just nitrogen, but other compounds that we don't want in drinking water, like more than 24 different drugs, pharmaceuticals, and personal care products. So my conclusions, therefore, are that, as I've shown you, Sagg Pond is experiencing blue-green algae blooms by multiple types of cyanobacteria, and they're producing the toxin microcystin. We have algae levels that are above the EPA standard. We've got the blue-green algae above the DEC standard, the oxygen levels below the DEC standard. We know for a fact that nitrogen is making all these things worse. We've shown that experimentally. We found that septic systems and fertilizer are the biggest sources of nitrogen, and so we now have a plan for addressing that. I'll end with just thanking all the good folks in my lab who are really the boots on the ground and the fins in the water, who are doing all the assessment of places like Sagg Pond. And of course, you're welcome to follow what we do in my lab on social media. So with that, I'm going to end it, and I think it's getting then turned over to Tom. And remember, Tom, you're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, okay. Can we see everything here? Okay, very good.
Looks good.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Chris. Well, as Chris mentioned, my name is Tom Varley. I'm the Watershed Manager for the Center for Clean Water Technology. Just a little bit about my background. I have 40 years experience in wastewater treatment. My specialty is operation and maintenance. I've operated a variety of treatment processes for nitrogen removal, from small to mid-sized facilities up to facilities treating 30 million gallons a day. Some of this experience was with what they call decentralized wastewater treatment systems through Suffolk County, treating like shopping malls and homeowner developments. I've also done some groundwater remediation treatment systems, hazardous site works, leachate treatment associated with landfills. So we've identified the problem. You heard Dr. Gobler. He talked about the role nitrogen has on our water quality. That nitrogen pollution is the greatest threat of our health to our local waters, and the largest source of nitrogen is from on-site septic systems. So what do we know? Well, we know installing low nitrogen septic systems is the most important thing we can do to improve our water quality. We also know that just waiting passively for individual homeowners to act means that our local waters are going to continue to be impacted. So we really need to accelerate the septic system upgrades. So if you look at the Sagg Pond Watershed, the areas in the dark colors right around the water body, that represents the 0 to 2 year travel time. And then aside from that, there's the 2 year to 10 year, then the 10 to 25 year. But if you look at the pinpoints, there's only 15 systems that have been installed in the watershed, and really only one on the pond front, which is a which I'll have a quicker impact on the water body there. So we really need a collective effort to make a difference. So how are we doing that? And one way is to just take a focused approach on the watersheds. Dr. Gobler and others are studying this water body here. So in January, the center collaborated with Peconic Land Trust to hire me as a watershed manager, and to focus specifically on Sagg Pond and Georgica Pond to accelerate the upgrades of this system, to guide the homeowners through the process. And it's a process to get your systems upgraded, and I'm going to share with you what goes into those things. The other thing is make sure that the upgrades are maximally protective of the pond. There are some systems that work better than others, and we want to make sure that what we're doing is actually going to make a difference. Beyond working with the homeowners, I'm going to make sure that the project is moving forward on a timely basis, track on a lot by lot basis, try to target areas that have low implementation of the upgrade programs. We're going to map this on GIS database and then update it as we get upgrades and other projects occur, and then hopefully we start seeing some real results in our loadings to the pond. So Chris mentioned about the traditional septic systems, that they really aren't designed to remove nitrogen removal. They were just designed to settle out some solids, put a little clearer water to the ground, but that clearer water did nothing to protect the water body. So Suffolk County has approved a number of low nitrogen advanced septic systems which meet the established standard of 19 milligrams per liter total nitrogen. All of these systems require a power source to aerate the wastewater. You got to provide the bacteria the right environment to remove the nitrogen. It employs the same process, same concept, same biological concept as municipal treatment plants. It's only on a smaller scale. So Chris had mentioned about the work that the center has been doing. They've been conducting research on developing a non-proprietary system we call nitrogen removing biofilters, or NRBs. And the way the NRBs work is it's basically an excavation where we install a layer of sand. That's usually a high level oxygen environment that the organisms convert the ammonia into a nitrate. And then there's another layer of sand and wood chips that creates an environment in the absence of oxygen that'll do our denitrification or the removal of the nitrates. So Chris mentioned that wastewater contains more than nitrogen. He mentioned about the emerging contaminants. It's just important to note here that the removal percentages that we're seeing on the NRBs exceed that of what a standard sewage treatment plant has removed. And this removal occurs in that oxic layer, that oxygen layer of the sand layer in the NRB. And the other systems out there, the other AI systems do not have that sand layer in their systems. They're just tanks with aerators on it. So we think there's a benefit to addressing some emerging contaminants in these systems. Chris also mentioned about being approved for additional provisional approval in Suffolk County. So we're hoping to see some more installations of these systems being implemented. Again, the performance of our systems, the other systems, there was a lot of systems that were piloted by Suffolk County. Everybody wanted to get into the market to provide systems. Only those systems that meet the county standard of 19 milligrams per liter move forward to proceed and eventually get their conventional or their provisional improvements to be installed in the systems. So, but we know not all sites are going to be suitable for NRBs. NRBs take a larger footprint than the standard commercial systems, but we still wanted a way to address of how do we get this level down below this county standard of 19. We think it's achievable. We showed it's achievable with our NRBs. So we've been working with what we call a wood chip polishing box, or wood chip box we call it, attaching them to commercial IA systems. So here's two sites that are in Georgica Pond. The first site actually had two IA systems on their property, and we connected that to one wood chip box. The systems were working fairly well. Their nitrate levels were around 5 milligrams per liter coming out of the system. But coming out of the wood chip box, we got that down to barely non-detected, 0.002 milligrams per liter on the nitrate level. The other site was a FujiClean system that wasn't working so well. It had a high level of nitrates coming into the system. So it was nitrifying good, it just wasn't denitrifying well. And that's where the wood chip box came in. And we were able to get a 3 milligram per liter output on this. So we think it really shows progress. The wood chip box will be installed after the IO system and before your drainage system, whether you have a leaching rings or a drain field. But we currently have several grant proposals to install more wood chip boxes so we can gather more data. And our goal is to have the wood chip boxes approved as a polishing unit and hopefully have additional grant incentives for the installation from Suffolk County. So our goal, our target would be, hey, take that target range of less than 19 milligrams per liter total nitrogen, add a wood chip box onto it, and we think we can get a target range of less than 5 milligrams per liter. And that's a significant reduction and improvement for our water quality we should see from that. Just a little quick diagram, a little picture of a wood chip biofilter. Very simple. All it is a plastic septic tank. You add a perforated pipe in there. The wood chips are submerged. And there are a standard for wood chips, a type of wood chips you use that the center has been doing tests on. And the water would upflow through these wood chips and remove the nitrate. Now, it's important to note that the wood chips actually don't remove the nitrate. It's actually the bacteria that removes the nitrate. The wood chips provide the environment for the bacteria to attach to and have a food source, the carbon in the wood, to remove the nitrogen. So we're pretty excited about the potential that wood chips do to actually even get the water cleaner than what we would get in the regular system. So let's get into the IA system, what's involved. First, there's a variety of available funding incentives. Suffolk County has septic improvement program. It's a base grant of $10,000. There's an additional $5,000 for low to moderate income applicants. And then there's an additional $5,000 you can get if your site needs a pressurized drain field. It's important to note that there is preferential consideration given to properties that have failed systems or failing systems, like you have to pump it out more than twice a year. So those applicants will jump in front of the line in front of other applicants. So I always encourage people to get your applications into the county as quickly as possible. New York State has a septic replacement program incentive as well. They offer up to $10,000 grant. And then the town of Southampton has a rebate program, which is $20,000 as a base rebate. And they also have an additional $5,000 for low and moderate income applicants there. The Suffolk County grant is paid directly to the contractor. And there's things that they don't pay for, like they won't pay for the design of the system. But the town grant, the town rebate does pay for things that the county grant doesn't, like the design, any test bore samples that you need, and other fees are eligible. They'll also cover some restoration costs, but they won't cover new plantings. If you have property that was disturbed, your grass was ripped up, they'll pay for that restoration costs, up to the grant amount. And they're basically restoring kind. They're not gonna plant new trees for you. So that's not part of the program, but they do cover a lot more than the county does. So what are the basic steps for your upgrade? Well, one I mentioned is submit your grant applications to the county and the town of Southampton. There's no separate application for the state. The county manages the state application process. So once you submit your application to the county, they automatically forward that information to the state. You don't have to wait to receive approval from one grant to submit the others. So get your applications into the county and to Southampton together. You'll probably hear from Southampton before you hear from Suffolk County. But get those applications in, and then you'll know with what kind of funds you'll have to help you make decisions as you move forward in the upgrade process. The next step would be to contract with a design professional for your plans. The size of the systems are based on the number of bedrooms. The county requires 110 gallons per day per bedroom. It doesn't really matter how many people you have. It's really based on the number of bedrooms, how they size it. One of the things that I've seen a lot is, engineers are talking with the homeowners. You may want to upsize your system if you're planning on doing an upgrade in the future, or maybe an expansion of your home, which is important, because if your home doesn't have a system that's designed for the number of bedrooms, then down the road, if you wanted to expand, they might want you to then do improvements to your system. So if you're going through this process now, the additional cost to upsize is not that great doing it now. Next, there's an installer list, an approved installer list that Suffolk County maintains. So you select an installer from that list. You also need to submit a application to Southampton Building Department for a IA system electrical permit. That's they require electrical connection, so you need a permit from Southampton. During installation, your inspectors will visit the site at various times, and then they'll also witness the startup of your system. So I mentioned the county pays the grant directly to the installer. You submit copies of your expenses after the installation for Southampton for reimbursement under the rebate program. So what to expect from the install? As much as installers try to minimize disruption, it's a big excavation. There's no way around it. So it's important that you work for your engineer on the location and how is big equipment that you're going to need for the excavation, how are you going to access the site to minimize impact to planting and trees. We've seen instances where we've had designs come back where it wasn't reviewed of where the system, what's a better place for the system to be. And it turns out that there was like 3 trees that were going to needed to be taken down on that property in order to get the install done, when the property had lots of land that this system could have been planned for. So it's important to work with the engineer ahead of time to talk about the location, to talk about what you're going to see, and what impact it's going to be to your existing property. Here's a picture of a couple of installations. This one's an Arenco installation on the left. You can see the large excavator in the back. They're actually installing a drain field here. And this system eventually will be backfilled and you'll just have this opening hatch here. This control panel was located close to the system. This was a new home installation. Here's another installation. Eventually this will all be backfilled in here, but you can see, you know, there's big piles of dirt. They have to move dirt around. They have to dig big holes. So, you know, it's just part of the process and you'll just have to, you know, we'll just have to deal with the grading and restoration. There are some visual impacts of these systems. The covers need to be accessible. There's the county requires a 3-year service contract with the installs. These systems are checked twice a year to make sure that they're in balance and they're working. So here's some examples of system installations. There's a Fuji Clean with there's 3 plastic manhole type covers that are in the grass. Same thing with hydro action. It's kind of hard to see in the picture here, but they're the same kind of thing like a Fuji Clean. Arenco has a different type of system. Their system is accessed through a big hatch. So they have that in their system. But then there are control panels that have to be installed. You have 2 options. You can install it right by the unit, or most people prefer to put the control panel remote. And here's an example of a Fuji Clean that they installed next to the house. This one, it's kind of hard to see in the picture, but right here is a hydro action control panel next to this utility panel. And here's a control panel for an Arenco system that was just attached to a side of a garage. Some homeowners have done some creative screening for their plots. This one had some nice plantings around their system. Here was some plantings that they tried hiding the covers a little bit. This one actually is the big Arenco hatch that is behind a row of hedges. This homeowner elected not to have the panel installed remotely. Their panel is on top of the actual system, so it sticks up a little bit, but they just made it part of the garden and they did some decorative planting around it. I was in visiting a system earlier this week, and that homeowner actually had pieces of astroturf cut that she put on top of each of these manhole covers to cover the system there. So what happens after your install? Well, Suffolk County, like I said, they're going to witness the startup. You're going to submit all your required documentation to the Town Community Preservation Department for your rebate. Payment usually takes 6 to 8 weeks. The county requires this 3-year service contract after the initial install. The homeowner is required to secure a service agreement each year after that. It can be with the initial service provider, or you can select to do a different service provider. Typical costs that we've seen really depends on the provider, but what we've seen is costs around $350 a year. Some might be $450. Depends on what they cover. Some people cover, if your system requires pumping, we'll pump it out. Other people, well, that would be an extra charge. So these are all things that I can help navigate with you as we compare costs from different installers and what they're providing, and to go through that process. So the assistance that I provide to the homeowners, it's no charge to you. It's being done through the grant, through the Peconic Land Trust. So I outline that there's a number of steps to go through, and my job is to guide you through this process. And I'm available to work with you individually for as much support as you need. I can meet you. We can meet by phone, Zoom. I'll meet you in person, whatever you're most comfortable with. This is my contact information. Please email me, call me. We can set up a time that works for both of us, and I can walk you through the process. There's a lot more details into this process. I gave you just a general overview. Some people want more help than others. For example, I've been assisting some homeowners and they just want to know about the grants, and they just want to know an overview, what they have to do. They move forward with the process. Sometimes they'll check back in with me and say, I got this done already. What's the next step? Or they just want to know, hey, who should I select for an engineer? I can give them 3 names to select one of them. Or if they want some more help with that, I can actually help solicit proposals from the engineers. And we can do the same thing with the installers. So it's a lengthy process. Each individual step is not hard, but it's hard to keep up with. And so I'm here to help you, and please give me a call. And with that, I'm going to pass over to Molly, and she's going to from Cornell Cooperative, and she's going to give her presentation.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, I'm going to give an update on the work that we've been doing in the sub-watershed. Again, my name is Molly Graffam. I work for Cornell Cooperative Extension as a water resource geochemical specialist, and my colleague Ron Paulsen is also on the call as well to help answer any questions and chime in if I forget anything. Just wanted to touch on a few things. I know Dr. Gobler and Tom just gave an update about the issue and the nitrogen problem. And one thing to keep in mind is that there are these other environmental things that are somewhat related to the nitrogen issue. You know, local temperatures in the northeastern US and just globally continue to get higher. We can't necessarily control that, but they will tend to exacerbate the nitrogen problem by speeding up algae growth and reducing dissolved oxygen concentration. So that is an issue as well. And then population density continues to rise. Also over the past few years, obviously people have been spending more time in their homes and out east year round. So that's something to consider as well. More people means more nitrogen. And then Dr. Gobler talked about the harmful algae blooms. And again, these are, you know, a human health concern. In 2021, we found that the Sagg Pond surface water had 2 to 16 times higher nitrogen concentration than was generally accepted as healthy. And so again, these current and anticipated threats are just exacerbating the nitrogen pollution problem and putting biodiversity at risk. But nitrogen is something that we can control. So the positive thing here is that we should start to, you know, work to solve this problem. This you saw earlier in Dr. Gobler's presentation, but it's a good place to kind of look and situate yourself. We have Poxabog Pond that's just north of Sagg Pond that we've started to do some work in. And again, this sub-watershed map is from the Suffolk County Sub-Watershed Wastewater Plan. One thing to keep in mind is that nitrogen that was added to the groundwater 10 to 25 years ago, which is shown in the yellow areas here, that nitrogen may just be entering the pond now, and groundwater travel time is relatively slow. So nitrogen that's added today will continue to enter the pond for decades. And water that is entering Sagg Pond has both new and old nitrogen because it's a mixture of these different sources and different groundwater travel times. We also started this project by looking at modeled water table elevations from the Suffolk County Sub-Watershed Plan and from CDM Engineering. So what you're seeing in this map on the right is water table elevation, again, modeled, and the blue lines represent the water table elevation. So the point here is that the closer the lines are together, the faster the modeled groundwater flow. And we used this information to help guide some of our measurements. And also one thing that's a useful piece of information is that coastal water bodies such as Sagg Pond have what's called a saltwater interface below the fresh groundwater. And this confines and focuses groundwater at the shoreline to relatively shallow depths. So this will become an important point that I'll bring up later on as well. Just to get onto the same, use some of the same terms here, we use this term called pore water, which is the water that's within the pond sediment. And it's often a mixture of groundwater and pond surface water. And the process of groundwater entering pond surface water is really because a pressure gradient is established between the groundwater table elevation and the pond water level, and water is flowing into the pond because of this pressure gradient. And so when pore water has elevated nutrient concentrations, that water is seeping into the pond surface water, and that's what's causing many of these surface water quality issues. For those of you who have seen this presentation last year, this may look familiar, but I wanted to go over some of the methods and some of the background data to help give you an idea of how we got to where we are and where we're going with this project. But basically, we started in 2021 and have been working in Sagg Pond and now moving into Poxabog Pond. Over 200 stations were surveyed with some specialized equipment to sample the pore water. And that probe is pictured on the left. So we poke this probe into the sediment in the pond bottom, and we can take samples when we find that the data suggests that there's presence of groundwater discharge. And then some of those stations were chosen for extra analysis where we measure the seepage flow rate with a seepage meter that's shown in the middle picture. And then the information that we really need is both the concentration of nutrients in the pore water and the flow rate, because that's how we can calculate nitrogen loading to the surface water. And then on the right side of the screen, I'm showing a picture of a core that we collected. So at every station we were collecting a core, and we were specifically looking for bottom type that shows very sandy or sandy and gravelly bottom type. Like, we're looking for these unique shoreline features and bottom types where we typically find groundwater seepage. And so we have characteristics of the bottom type and with GPS locations to create maps to help prioritize shoreline areas for remediation where we find that there are these high nitrogen loading zones. These maps may look familiar, but again, to orient you, on the left-hand side, I'm showing nitrate, a map of all of the stations where we collected nitrate. And we found across Sagg Pond, the pore water nitrate ranged anywhere from less than detectable, so less than 0.4, all the way up to 16 milligrams per liter. And just to orient you, typical maybe non-contaminated groundwater or pristine groundwater would have definitely less than 2 milligrams per liter of nitrate, maybe even less than 1. So in some of the pore water, we were finding up to 16 milligrams per liter, which is really high. And we found that over 50% of the pore water samples had greater than 2 milligrams per liter, again, indicating excessive nitrogen pollution. But you'll notice that it was not high everywhere. We found mostly in the northern part of the pond, where you see those orange, bright orange colors on the northern side, and along the western shoreline, we found some really high values there. There were very low values on the southern half as we got closer to the ocean. And then we again looked at specific locations to calculate or to measure the seepage flow rate. So those I'm showing here with the red dots in that middle map. We found that the rates north of Bridge Lane were always positive and were higher on the west side of the shoreline. And then at certain locations, the seepage rate actually increased above baseline when the ocean inlet was open. So we were measuring groundwater seepage rates during that opening of the cut, and we saw that groundwater seepage rates increased during that time, which was really an interesting finding from last year. And then lastly, we look at conductivity or salinity is kind of a synonym for conductivity. So we found that the pore water ranged from very fresh, which is shown in that yellow color, to very salty, which is shown by the red color. And there was a large north-south gradient. And again, especially on the northern and western shorelines, this was highly influenced by groundwater, which is consistent with the model, and multiple independent groups have now kind of identified this northern and western shoreline as the issue. In 2022, we wanted to go back to some of the same locations to confirm that the pore water nitrate values were consistently high, that it wasn't just a fluke that we measured really high values in a specific location. So we went back to some specific areas where we wanted to look a little bit further and deeper into the data. So we looked just north of Bridge Lane on the eastern shoreline, which is what you're seeing in this map here. From 2021 to 2022, that's the data shown in this larger map here. And again, we found pore water nitrate values just along this 500 to 1,000 foot shoreline area ranged anywhere from less than detectable, less than 0.4, all the way up to almost 16 milligrams per liter. So it's not always consistent across the shoreline. It's kind of patchy, but we did find multiple high values right at this shoreline. And another area that we wanted to look at was the northwestern shoreline. So I've highlighted that here. We went back in 2022 to check some of the values here. And again, we found over this maybe 500 to 1,000 foot area that the pore water nitrate values ranged from less than detectable all the way up to just over 12 milligrams per liter. So in 2022, a lot of our work was on site characterization for remediation to help solve this issue, because we felt like we've identified some shoreline areas that we can target for remediation that have high nitrogen loading. And now that's where we want to move inland to start to characterize the shoreline areas a bit further so we can move forward with remediation. So we looked at 3 different sites. We looked at the Smith Corner Preserve, the agricultural site just north of Bridge Lane on the eastern shoreline, and then a residential site also on the eastern shoreline on the northern half of Sagg Pond. So we collected data that will help us understand the soil conditions, and we analyzed the soil for grain size analysis. We also installed temporary wells to understand the groundwater about 50 to 100 feet inland from the shoreline. And we installed those wells about 50 to 100 feet apart. And then we had the wells surveyed, and we were looking at the water table elevation and figuring out groundwater velocity in specific areas. So just to give you a little bit of a video of what this actually looks like, when we install the wells, they eventually, you don't see anything above the surface. So this picture here shows what the wells look like at the surface on somebody's lawn. It's all below ground, and we install them to about 40 feet deep. I'll just play this little video again. We install them to about 40 feet deep, and then we retract the wells in 5-foot sections. So we are able to understand what the groundwater looks like at different depth intervals. And this is the data that was largely came out of that site characterization work. We found that the preserve, the Smith Corner Preserve area, had almost no nitrate, very little nitrate, mostly undetectable. In the second site, where there was moderate groundwater flow, we found that the nitrate concentrations were elevated at about 25 feet to 40 feet below grade. So what you're looking at in this plot is nitrate concentrations below grade, so in the groundwater, and then over a horizontal distance, moving from south to north, from left to right. So we found high hits in the groundwater up to 16 milligrams per liter, which was consistent with what we found offshore in the pore water. And then at the residential site where there's highest groundwater flow, we also found that the nitrate values were highest from about 25 feet to 45 feet below grade. And we know that the nitrogen is a combination of current and legacy sources, and that the subwatershed had more agricultural sources, and now land use has shifted and it's become more residential. So the highest groundwater nitrate values were observed 20 to 40 feet below grade, which actually tells us that this nitrate came from further within the subwatershed, because we would have seen it just right at the surface if it was more newer nitrogen. So the depth that we find it gives us insight into how it came from further within the subwatershed. And the subwatershed land use, again, is currently primarily residential and agricultural, which both sources of septic nitrogen and residential and agriculture fertilizers. It's probably a combination of all of this. So we decided to move forward with studying these two sites where we found the highest nitrate. And these sites are definitely going to be useful sites to move forward with remediation. And one of the remediation technologies that we're most excited about are permeable reactive barriers. They're a sustainable approach. They're installed below ground, so no above ground structures. They use natural materials, sand, wood chips, and gravel. They rely on the naturally occurring microbes to transform nitrate, which is the nutrient and pollutant form of nitrogen, into a harmless nitrogen gas. And it actually uses the same mechanism that Tom had described earlier that happens in NRBs. It's the microbes that are doing this work for us. And PRBs are passive. They require no energy input after installation. They've also been shown to be cost effective because they last for decades without maintenance. And they're resilient to seawater intrusion. They're adaptable to rising water levels. And again, they have no above ground structures. So just to quickly sidetrack from Sagg Pond, I wanted to let you know about this system that we've been monitoring for several years now in conjunction with the Center for Clean Water Technology. Back in 2020, we were able to install this permeable reactive barrier behind a bulkhead in Hampton Bays. And we used this opportunity to look at different installation approaches. So we have replication of the different installations. We have a 2.5 foot thick PRB, a 5 foot thick PRB. We have a column approach, which is a staggered array of columns. And then we had a control area with no PRB media, so no wood chips. And we've been monitoring this system for several years now. So in my last presentation, I showed data from April 2022. This is our most recent data from September 2022. So you'll see nitrate concentration on the y-axis, and then we have our different sampling ports, up gradient of the PRB, within the PRB, and down gradient of the PRB. The first thing you'll notice is that the control areas shown in black have really no change from the up gradient to the down gradient side. So there was no nitrogen removal. And then the different installation types where we do have wood chip, media, and PRB present, there is significant nitrogen removal. The PRB consistently removes 80 to 100%, whereas the control areas with just native sand do not provide that benefit of nitrogen removal. And So this is really exciting results that we want to continue to build upon. And the column approach is one thing that we are interested in looking at Sagg Pond, because it uses less wood chips and it can probably be installed with an equipment that we have called the geoprobe, and it may be more cost efficient. So we'd like to continue to work on developing and improving upon the column array method. We also, in my last presentation, talked about this PRB that was happening in 3 Mile Harbor. It had just, the project had just started back in October when I spoke to you guys last, and now it was finished in December. So this is a different type of PRB using a carbon emulsion injection approach. And this was installed in 3 Mile Harbor just at the end of last year. And there ended up being 6 clusters with 3 injection wells per cluster. And this engineering company that we were working with, we decided on using a 1% carbon solution, which is a relatively low percentage of carbon. So one of our research questions is like, can we increase the carbon solution strength and maybe make the PRB smaller? That's something that we want to look at, because the low concentration required a large area of groundwater displacement. And we'll be monitoring this system starting this year. So maybe in my next presentation, I'll have more results to share on this project, but this is an exciting project that's moving forward as well. So back to Sagg Pond. Why is Sagg Pond a place to invest and use PRBs? The shape of Sagg Pond is, it's got an extensive shoreline and shallow water depth. So this ratio of shoreline to pond area is high, which means there's a lot of area for groundwater seepage to be happening. And we've identified these hotspots where we think PRBs will be useful. The land use is largely privately owned, residential and agricultural. So we've found that projects can move forward relatively quickly on privately owned land, which is useful because we want these projects to move forward so that we can actually get remediation installed. The magnitude of the pollution problem here is quite high, because the pore water and surface water levels that we found are kind of alarming, and definitely not considered healthy. So especially along the north and western shoreline of Sagg Pond, those are the areas of focus. And then the pond is severely impaired, but it has not yet reached kind of an irreversible threshold. So this is a place where we can invest in PRBs, which are one tool along with upgrading septics that can be used to help preserve the pond for future generations. And we recently submitted a proposal to the town of Southampton to install a PRB on the eastern shoreline north of Bridge Lane and do additional site characterization work on the northwestern shoreline. We're definitely going to move forward with this approach of using columns in a staggered array. And we just found out today that the town is currently reviewing our application. We do know that the PRB may require a permit from DEC, so we'll be contacting them and making sure that we get any permits secured before that installation happens. And then meanwhile, while the permitting and the application review process is happening, we'll also be doing some piloting research, including lab research and field research, to make the system more cost effective, to have a smaller footprint, and to have higher nitrogen removal efficiency. Now shifting over to Sagg Pond quickly. We did some work in 2022. It was interesting because we started our work during drought conditions. So we expected to have more water. The pond water was very low. That's a picture of me basically in the middle of the pond where we thought there would be water, but instead there was vast areas of dry exposed shoreline. And so we knew we needed to do some more measurements at a seasonal high water table. So this spring, we did some more measurements. We installed a water level gauge within the pond. And now this spring, the pond water level is about 1 to 2 feet higher than it was last summer. But there are still exposed areas of shoreline without vegetation. And birds tend to congregate on the shoreline there and leave their droppings. We also found last year that the pore water in this pond had very high levels of TKN, which is organic nitrogen and ammonium, and there was little to no nitrate. So it was quite different than Sagg Pond. And this year in 2023, we found that is still consistent. You know, we found high levels of TKN. Looking at USGS groundwater level data from nearby, we found that historically the groundwater level may be ranging from 30 to 42 feet below grade. But as of April 2023, when we were doing some of our measurements, the water level was, the depth of water was relatively high, which means that the pond level is low. So we think that the conditions that are happening right now and this spring still represent very dry conditions compared to the historic data. We'll be monitoring water level at 2 locations around the pond. And we do plan to install additional wells, especially at the town property that's in the southeastern corner of the map. That's where the Peconic Land Trust may be potentially doing an agricultural demonstration area. So this area is of interest to us and to the Peconic Land Trust and to the town. So we'll be focusing a lot of efforts in that southeastern corner of Poxbog Pond. This spring, we did a groundwater seepage study around the pond. And I'm just highlighting 2 areas here in the north and south of the pond, shown by the blue and red triangles in the map. The blue triangle is that northern part of the pond. We found positive discharge rates. So about 40 milliliters per minute was the flow rate that we measured at that area, but we still found elevated TKN in the pore water. So this means that, you know, nitrogen is impacting the pond water quality there. And then in the southern area, which is, I'm showing the location shown by that red triangle, we actually found negative seepage rates, which means surface water from the pond was actually recharging and going back down into the aquifer and into the groundwater. And that means that this nitrogen, that like the pond surface water and the pore water that's kind of charged with nitrogen, may be impacting Sagg Pond water quality, because Poxabog Pond is north of Sagg Pond. So we're really interested in looking more into what's happening at that southern region of the pond. And just to summarize, kind of, it's like a north versus south story at Poxabog Pond. The north had positive seepage rates, presence of shoreline features, including like gravel, which indicates the presence of groundwater seepage. It was generally healthier. We saw submerged grasses, and then the shoreline vegetation went right up to where the water line was. So there was less area exposed for bird populations. And although we did see elevated TKN levels in the pore water, because of the presence of the shoreline and submerged vegetation, they may be able to help uptake the nutrients. Whereas in the southern part of the pond, there was negative seepage rates, or what we call groundwater recharge back into the aquifer. There was more mucky, muddy sediment and very little shoreline vegetation, large areas devoid of anything, heavy presence of bird populations. And so the southern conditions are probably impacting the groundwater, which then reaches Sagg Pond further south. In summary, we found that the northern and southern discharge rates and recharge rates are roughly equal. So the pond is a very dynamic system, but the water level looks static simply because there's a hydraulic equilibrium. And the 2022 results indicated that there was little to no groundwater seepage, probably because we did it during a drought period. The 2023 results suggest that seasonal precipitation and water table height changes play a large role in the groundwater seepage rates. And then in both years, we found that TKN, mostly ammonium, was the dominant nitrogen species. And then historic water level data indicates that this pond is probably still in a drought condition, and wetter years may have significantly more groundwater seepage, especially in the northern half of the pond. So for the next steps for this pond, we don't really know what the source of the elevated TKN is, but we can kind of assume that there's a reservoir and a storage of nitrogen built up in the sediment, possibly because of the heavy bird population that's kind of congregating on the shoreline. And then we'd also like to know, does the groundwater just south of Sagg Pond, which is headed towards Sagg, have elevated TKN? So we plan on installing some more groundwater wells along Sagg Lane, along that property that the town owns, to help answer that question. And then in the future, if the Peconic Land Trust does end up using that plot for an agricultural demonstration area, I'm not sure if they will be irrigating with the groundwater, but that groundwater may be rich in nitrogen, so it could actually be useful to irrigate the agricultural demonstration area with the nitrogen-rich groundwater to help remove some of those nutrients. And in general, we will be quantifying some of the area of exposed shoreline and recommending native plantings to help reduce bird congregation, which seems to be a major issue at this pond. And in general, the nitrogen issue has been something that's developed over decades. So we have to be vigilant about these different solutions and tools that we can implement to help improve water quality. And over the next 3 to 5 years, we hope to continue doing applied research and remediation projects to improve the water quality and maintain it for your public enjoyment and for just maintaining habitat biodiversity. So I'd like to thank the Peconic Land Trust, our groundwater team, and then specifically some Sagg sub-watershed residents, Philippa Weissman, Charles de Gunsberg, and as always, the Southampton trustees and the Center for Clean Water Technology, who's been a great collaborator and partner in all of this.
And thank you, Molly. That was terrific. And all of our presenters. We're going to now turn it over to questions, which there were quite a few of. So Olivia, I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of head that for us. We'll probably only get to a few of them. I'd like to try to get us done by, let's say, 8:35. So maybe 10 minutes of questions. Matt can do a little bit of a wrap up. And then anything we don't get to, we will definitely be following up with everyone. We'll both include the questions in a follow-up email to anyone who received the original invitation, as well as follow up with you individually. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Liv.
Yeah, thank you all so much. These are fantastic questions. First, I think Liz Hamburg asked this one, and my anxiety brain, it really resonated. So even if we are not drinking water, is it safe to boat in the pond when there's potential for algae blooms? Are we expecting algae blooms to happen this summer? And could you clarify that small amounts of water, like what you would get splashed with getting in and out of a kayak, is safe? Maybe Dr. Gobler, if you wanted to answer that one.
Sure. So we monitor the pond every week, starting probably by the end of the month. And every week we're making measurements, and the measurements we make, we're comparing to the state standards. And, what we've typically seen is in the spring, conditions are good, and in the summer, we need to be careful. But again, we're out there every week. And if and when the levels of blue-green algae reach a level that exceeds the DEC standard, we then, that day or within, 24 hours, are alerting both the New York State DEC and the Suffolk County Department of Health Services. And that triggers a process whereby either the county or the town trustees would put signage up to indicate to the public that there is a blue-green algae bloom and they should not be recreating in the water. And so that's the policy. And again, this is based on our weekly measurements. So, and it's, the nice thing is it's totally cut and dry, right? So it's a quantitative measurement, either above or below that level. And so there's no sort of gray area in it all.
Thank you. A few people had asked this one in DMs. What's the best way to support this project? How do we make this research possible, I guess? I don't know if Matt or maybe Amanda, you want to answer that one?
Sure. I had addressed this at the beginning, that this year we have a goal of $495,000. We've raised about $210,000 out of that. That money this year will go towards the actual installation of PRB by Molly and her team. Equipment that will, like things like new augers in order to do testing for wells, just basic research and development that needs to be ongoing. And then any coordination for the trust and our work with Cornell. So that's, we are definitely in need of funding to get this done. We've had such a generous outpouring in the past few years since this was brought to us. And I will put the website information into the chat in a moment. And you can also just reach out to me. I'll put my email in there as well if you're interested in funding or know others who might be.
And I'll just add to that, there are certain aspects of this project, of the beginning research, for example, that cannot be, we can't find public dollars for it. So the fundraising goal is so important to continue this work.
Yeah.
Sometimes we have to do a lot of background work before we can get municipal dollars. So again, we thank you for your support.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Matt.
So I'm going to ask this one because I'm the last presentation of these. I know this was addressed and I've forgotten the answer and I'm very embarrassed. Mark McIntyre asked, what causes the trustees to open and close the tidal ponds?
And in happy news, we have a trustee here. So Ann Welker can speak for the trustees without me having or anyone else having to do so.
Nice one, Chris. Way to throw it back.
Hi, everybody. So your question was, Mark, what creates the trigger for opening, I believe. So we have an actual, there's a gauge. If you're driving across the Bridge Lane Bridge and you pull over into the little boat ramp area and you look back to the west, you'll see there is a black and white striped gauge that's located on the far side of the bridge. And at this point, the orange opening line is underwater. That gauge has been set up, that was set up many years ago, but the orange opening line is a trigger. We also we rely on Dr. Gobler's telemetry buoy for looking at levels of dissolved oxygen, of course, the harmful algal blooms impact. But I think what's the largest problem for us, it's easy to get the cut open between the fall, winter, and early spring months. But we are precluded from opening from April 1st until September 1st by the endangered species season and the presence of piping plovers. And so this is a fairly, I'm trying to be as concise as possible with that explanation, but if you reach out to me, my information is on the trustee website. I am happy to expand on this, but yeah, so there are many parameters that we look at. I hope that was helpful.
Yes, thank you, Anne. And let's see. I apologize if I mispronounce anyone's name, by the way. Ellie Porter Trubert asked what the lifespan is of these systems and what happens when the wood chips break down. I believe this was about the IA systems.
Yeah. Yeah, so the story I always like to tell is the time I went to Copenhagen in Denmark, and I visited a museum that was right on a fjord, and it had a Viking ship in it that was 1,000 years old. And that Viking ship had just been pulled out of the bottom of the fjord. Fjord is an estuary in Northern Europe that they often are anoxic or have no oxygen in that water. And so the reason that a wooden Viking ship that's spent 1,000 years in water could still be visible today after sitting at the bottom of that fjord for 1,000 years is because the bottom of that fjord was anoxic. And so wood in water in a non-oxygen environment degrades very, very slowly. Now, that being said, we're not putting 1,000-year guarantee on our systems, but we do think that the wood chips will last for decades. And one of the iterations of our NRBs, we actually, and also the wood chip box add-on that Tom installed, we could actually access those wood chips. So if for some reason the wood chips were bad, something got into the wood chip box, we could actually go in and replace them as needed. But we think they'll last a long time. And since I'm jabbering, I'll just mention that another thing people can do to support the program is they can just send an email to Tom, and he can talk to them just about what it would be like to upgrade their system and what are the prospects and what might be the cost. And yeah.
That kind of leads me into my next and well, possibly last question, but my next question, which is, what is the scope of Tom's work? Are you focusing only on the watersheds of Sagg and Georgica Pond, the town of Southampton, all of Suffolk County?
Okay, I'll address that. Primarily, since this was funded by the Peconic Land Trust, it's focusing on the Sagaponic and Georgica Pond. However, there's a lot of insight that we can get from working in other watersheds or helping other people. I've had people reach out to me, and sometimes it's just to understand the grant program. It's not taking a lot of my time. It's not taken away from my core work. So I provide some insight and some guidance to those people. But I also gain a lot of information, and I'll give you an example. We had the folks from the Lionhead Beach Association up in the Springs area, and they were very interested in what we were doing as an approach to a watershed, because they want to do the same thing over in their watershed. And I've gained so much insight from talking to those folks. I actually visited one of their systems that a homeowner, had a service provider coming and servicing the unit, and does this sound right? This is what he's telling me, so, I went out to understand the system. I actually brought the manufacturer of the system out there to take a look on the system to ensure the homeowner of, hey, this is typically what you should see in a system. So it's educating the homeowner. They also provided some information to me. They've done some outreach to homeowners on basic general, how much are you aware of these new systems? Are you aware of the nitrogen problems? But also people that have systems installed. And I believe it was a survey that East Hampton had done, and they were able to share the results with me. And I went through those, and I saw what the common comments were from people who actually had systems installed. And part of it was, well, they didn't know there was going to be a disruption to the property, or I wish I knew this, or that aspect of it. So I take that information, and it just gives me another data point, and it gives me more information, so that when I'm helping a homeowner, I'm steering them in the right direction. And it's based on facts. I've met with installers, I've met with designers, I met with the the distributors of the of each of the systems there, because I want to find out as much information as I can. And as soon as I know that, then I share that with each of the homeowners that I'm working with to help them with their process. But it's important, and just to give an idea of how I work with people, look, it's very much, I work very collaboratively with you. It depends on what help you want, but also I'm very cognizant of the fact that it's your property. This is your system. I can recommend people, but ultimately you're the one that's going to make the decision. You're going to have the contract with the designer, the contract with the installer, but I can help you navigate that process. I can help you interpret different proposals that are coming in from people. So then you're making a decision. And I feel that when the homeowners understand what they're in for, understand, then they're more likely to move forward with the project. It's not a surprise because I'm explaining, just like contractors are saying, I can surgically install this system. You can't surgically install it. They're going to dig a big hole in your yard. But we didn't move to Long Island and stay on Long Island because of our grass or our plantings. Those are things that we enhance our property. But we all live here because we love our environment, we love the water. So those are our top priorities. And if it means that we need to do some restoration on our property afterwards, but we need to protect our water. And that's really the goal of what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Tom. Let me see. Well, I see that we're past 8:30. And so grateful that 26 people have stuck with us this long. Thank you so much. Matt, did you have anything you wanted to?
Yeah, I'll just wrap it up by saying, again, we're going to get back to everybody with their individual questions. And then one thing we didn't mention was I work with Dr. Bruce Horwith, who's here, and we offer free at-home consultations. There's a lot of things you can do to reduce kind of your nitrogen input. So he has specialization in buffer plantings, gardening, lawn care techniques. And then, he can also put you in touch with experts like Tom. So we'll put his email and contact information in the follow-up. And if you'd like him to come over one day when you're hanging out at your house, free consultation to see, what you can do to improve Sagg Pond. But other than that, thank you everybody. Thank you everybody for coming. Really, it's been great.
Okay.
So with that, have a good night.
Yeah.
It
Thank you
has.
so
Thank you
much.
so much, everybody.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.